Hello, my name is Bob Tribe, and welcome to Valley to Vietnam. Valley to Vietnam is a joint effort between the Sacramento Public Library and the Vietnam Veterans of America, Chapter 500. It is our intent to trace the arc of experience between Sacramento and Vietnam for our local Vietnam-era vets. Today our guest is Tom Hayes, who is a Marine Corps lieutenant and maybe a captain.
Captain after I got out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, welcome, Tom. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Tom has lived here in Sacramento since 1975, I believe.
Correct.
So he wasn't raised here, but you were raised where? All over.
All over. My father was a career Air Force officer, so I lived throughout the United States, and but most of the time actually was in California, starting with Riverside, California,
okay,
and then up to Merced, Castle Air Force Base, and then Beale Air Force Base, which is just up in the Marysville area.
So before you went in the Marine Corps, you were really a local. You were living.
My enlistment into the Marine Corps came from Beale Air Force Base, California. So yes,
yeah.
I was local.
Okay, your father. You've got this family with military history. Your father was a B-24 pilot in World War II.
My father was a B-24 pilot. He flew about 30 missions. His first tour, he was into his second tour, volunteered to do that when his brother, a Marine, was killed on Guam, the guy that I'm named after, Tom Hayes. And in those days, you could assert a sole surviving son privilege exception. So my grandmother said that he was her sole surviving son, and he was pulled back from flying his missions. He was flying between England and Germany at that time in B-24s.
One of my favorite old movies was 12 O'Clock High with Gregory Pecks, and the anguish that he was going through commanding that group as those pilots headed over, Europe, and they had horrible casualties, right?
Very high attrition rates. Bomber crews, their life expectancy wasn't too much.
Right. I heard it was close to 70%.
Okay.
Let's see. You, as you mentioned, you grew up in all these numerous towns close to Air Force bases. So, Ossing, New York, Riverside, California, Ralston, Nebraska. Atwater, California, and Marysville.
Right.
You attended how many schools?
Numerous. I think I counted 7 between kindergarten and 12th grade, that I had 7 different schools. But you lose track of it, being a military brat.
Yeah.
That's just part of what you did. You moved around.
That seemed normal to you then?
It seemed normal, yeah. As a matter of fact, you got to sort of anticipate it, and I liked it.
You didn't have any of those sad things where you had to leave a dog behind or a best friend or anything like that? Okay.
We packed up everything and took them with.
I saw that movie, I think.
Yeah.
You ended up going initially to the University of Oregon and then San Jose State?
I went to Oregon State University for 2 years, and then I transferred to San Jose State. And at the same time of the transfer was about the time that I signed my commitment to the Marine Corps. I went into the platoon leader corps and spent 6 weeks after my sophomore year in college and 6 weeks after my junior year in college, and was commissioned after graduating from San Jose State in 1968.
So in 1968, when you graduated, you essentially joined the Marine Corps automatically. You got married.
Correct.
Yeah. To your wife, Mary, who you're still married to.
Yes. Very fortunate about that.
And you have children?
Two daughters.
Very nice.
Both of whom live in the Sacramento area.
Oh, that's great.
So.
Yeah. Then I guess the first thing you do is go to the basic school, as they call it.
Marine Corps officers all go through what they call a basic school. 6 months after your commission, they trade in your sergeants that you had in your basic training, your platoon leader corps training, and we then had captains. So you go through 6 months of more rigorous training and physically demanding training, and then you are ready to go on active, in an online position.
And they're essentially weeding people out that they don't think can cut it?
Most of the people were weeded out during before commissioning.
Okay, yeah.
I don't. We maybe lost one or two for various reasons during the basic school.
And the basic school was where?
Quantico, Virginia.
Okay. And then you take a short trip to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina?
Went to Camp Lejeune to combat engineer school, primarily to learn how to do to detect and remove landmines and booby traps.
You know, I think
now they call them IEDs. And
right.
We call them landmines and booby traps.
And given that time frame, I think I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, when you were at Camp Lejeune, so I wasn't very far away from you. And then you finally go to Civil Affairs School, which seemed like a real weird thing.
It's one of those military mistakes. We were had orders to go to Vietnam, and got orders interdicting that and sending 4 Marine second lieutenants to an Army Lieutenant Colonel school called Civil Affairs School. We were never going to use that training at all, but the Marine Corps in its ultimate wisdom sent us there, and so we went to, before we went to Vietnam, spent 6 weeks in Georgia.
Sometimes they just try to fill in the dead time with all kinds of strange things.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
So then you and your wife drive across the country, stop and see your folks at Beale.
Mm-hmm.
Your father was the wing commander of the SR-71
Let's see, that was by '68. So yes, he was the wing commander of the SR-71 wing. That's an Air Force reconnaissance plane.
It's a beautiful aircraft. I just got an email recently showing it's the 50th anniversary of the initial development of that, and it still looks spooky.
I remember 1964 is when he first went to Beale, and they didn't even have an airplane when they first got there, but that was the beginning of it, yes.
There was a little fact in this thing. It said that when you're piloting the SR-71, you had to keep it at between 1 and 2 degrees of the recommended pitch, or you'd lose control because you were going Mach 3.
Actually, that's true, and I think that they had at least one that broke in half right behind the cockpit.
Wow. Because
the pressure was so much if you didn't have the right attitude.
Did those guys get out of it, or?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's good. So now you're headed for Vietnam, and you arrived when?
April of 1969, I arrived in Vietnam.
Okay. And you, I guess, head where?
Danang. I was assigned to the 1st Engineer Battalion, Charlie Company, 3rd Platoon, became a platoon commander, which my primary responsibilities initially was to supervise teams of Marines that went out and did landmines and booby traps detection and removal.
Okay. And we've talked about this a little before, but if you could just tell us, what did a typical week of your platoon consist of, say?
Well, it was more like a typical day. In those initial days,
Okay.
It was at dawn, I would have to have half a dozen landmine booby trap sweep teams going out, clearing roads and making sure that they were safe for people to, for the rest of the Marines that were traveling by vehicle or Amtrak or something to go up and use the roads.
And most people have this thing in their head where they see, some infantry type or engineer type walking down a road with a big minesweeper that looks like a metal detector or something. Did you guys do that, or what?
Oh yeah, we had to by order. My teams never had much luck finding landmines and booby traps with those metal detectors, those mine detectors. Most of the landmines that we found, the big ones in the road, were not a lot of metal in them. So
yeah.
So those minesweepers didn't do us much good. Some of my fellow platoon commanders said that they worked pretty well for them. I just never had that experience.
Right. So did you use them anyway?
Absolutely.
Because you were ordered to.
We were ordered to.
Okay, yeah, I know how that works. you worked in different areas around Danang. Why don't you say a little bit about where you were?
Well, there are a lot of fire support bases, hills around Danang. I had minesweep teams on a lot of them. At one stretch, I spent 6 straight weeks in something called the Thonduck Corridor, which is, there was no base of operations there. We just moved it up and down about a 12-mile stretch of road, clearing mines and booby traps. And so I was there. And then a few months later, we moved down to an area called, that was down near a place called LZ Baldy and Fire Support Base Ross.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those.
And we took over that stretch from the Army and did our operations again, doing mine sweeps and booby trap removal, detection and removal. That was in the late fall of '69. And
did you find a variety of different type mines, or were they pretty standard, or what?
No, they improvised, you know. They
Yeah.
tried to use our equipment and our munitions.
Right.
And so they would use everything from artillery shells that did not go off,
Yeah.
or they'd get a hold of satchel charges and put those in the roads. That's a 40-pound block of C4 that would pretty much demolish a vehicle if it hit it.
Oh yeah,
So
that's a lot of C4.
Yeah, they were not standard. They were
Yeah,
they were improvised.
Whatever they could
Yeah,
come up with. You told me about one of your men stepping on a mine.
It wasn't one of my men. It was, but he stepped on the edge of a box that was a mine that was set up to be an anti-personnel mine, and luckily it was in a wooden box, and he stepped on the edge of the box and had the presence of mind to call us over, and we uncovered it and then blew it up in place.
And basically, it was a big box. Didn't you say it was like a 55-pound thing or something?
It wasn't that big, but it was about as big as a shoebox. And,
Yeah.
but it was, the charge was separate from that. It was a shaped charge filled with shrapnel in a metal container, and the idea was whoever stepped on this box would force two connect. It was going to be detonated by an electronic charge, and
Right.
they put two
like tinfoil or something.
tinfoil or something in
Yeah.
there, and a battery.
Right.
And luckily, the guy that stepped on it did not make that connection. So
Wow. So they call the engineers when something like that happens.
Yes.
It says, "Save us."
yes.
Okay. You talked about an incident when you suddenly were, after being out in the field for 6 weeks with no showers and minimal food,
Yeah.
you came back in and were ready to get cleaned up and everything, and they decided to make you a pay officer.
Oh yeah.
And there was an incident
there's a-
regarding a Jeep in that I thought was pretty intriguing.
Well, that was after that I came out of the field, and we'd been out for 6 weeks, and every once in a while the Marine Corps, I guess all of the military over there, would say that your funny money, they were military payment certificates. We didn't have dollar bills. We had specially issued currency called military payment certificates. And on one day they said, all right, those are all no good anymore. We're going to replace them.
Right.
Because they'd get into the black market. And so in one day I was supposed to go around to the whole battalion, no matter where they were, and tried to make the exchange. And we got to one area and we got pinned down and couldn't get there, pinned down by an enemy sniper. And so I went back to our rear area, and the next day I was going somewhere else, and someone else went out there. One of my the lieutenant, I was the senior person in the company at that time, and one of the other lieutenants went out there, and they unfortunately hit a landmine going out to the same location we tried to get to the day before. So.
And there was 3 men in this Jeep, and
3 men.
And 2 were killed.
2 were killed.
Yeah. And it was a miracle that the
lieutenant did not get killed. I subsequently visited him on the hospital ship, the Navy hospital ship Sanctuary, and all his skin was ripped off, basically the whole part of his body. From
Wow.
it was a large landmine that he hit.
Would that grow back, or would that be permanent burn scars, or what?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I never saw him after we left Vietnam.
Right. Wow. So how did your feelings about Vietnam change? I mean, what were your initial sort of thoughts when you were going over, and what did you think after you left?
Oh, I guess you go over there thinking you're going to help curb the spread of communism through Southeast Asia.
Right.
You're going over to help people live in a representative democracy. I guess in the end, I was disappointed that myself and other Marines seemed more motivated toward those ends than the local population.
Right.
So.
You came back in April of 1970.
Correct.
And initially you figured you were going to end up at El Toro, which was sort of a dream location.
Boy, wouldn't that have been nice?
Yeah, but that didn't happen.
No, I got Yuma, Arizona.
Oh my God.
Which is in the middle of the desert. There's a Marine, that's part of the 3rd Marine Air Wing or whatever that was at that time.
Yeah.
And they were just awash in second lieutenants. I was part of the first troop withdrawal ordered by President Nixon, and so they had too many lieutenants coming back, and they sent one of them, me, to Yuma, Arizona. So.
And you told me one of the reasons they picked a god-awful place like Yuma was that the flying time is fantastic.
Oh yeah,
there.
the weather in Yuma is ideal for if you want to run an air wing.
So, how did your wife adjust to Yuma?
She didn't care for Yuma too much, but I have fond memories. We had our first daughter there.
Oh, nice.
Christy was born in Yuma, Arizona.
Oh, neat.
So.
And then you came out of the Marine Corps in May of 1971.
Correct.
Yeah. And you went back to school.
Yes, I went back to San Jose State and got a master's degree in business.
All right. And your first job was with?
The General Accounting Office, now called the Governmental Accounting Office of the federal government, doing management audits to see if you could make federal programs work any more efficiently or effectively.
Now you would do these management audits or program audits, and would those changes be implemented? You know,
most of the time, but those programs, they're so large that even implementing the recommendations didn't make them perfect, or sometimes not even better.
Well, it's a good function. I know. Later, I would look at a lot of those state program audits before I applied for certain jobs. I wanted to know what was wrong with agencies, and I used one of your agencies to do that.
Yeah, that was after I became Auditor General of California.
Right.
And we both worked for the state for a number of years. So, yeah, they're very. It's a very important function. They save much more money than they cost.
Uh-huh.
But they don't make the system perfect. There's nothing that can make the system perfect. But I served as Auditor General for 10 years, and I was happy to do it.
And just to drop back a little bit, that link there is you were working for the GAO, you were living in San Jose and working in San Francisco, so you had a god-awful commute every day.
And traveled a lot, and I had the opportunity to move to Sacramento, which I jumped at, and I've been here ever since.
And you said that at one point GAO wanted to send you to Washington, D.C., and you didn't want to do that.
I didn't want to leave Sacramento and go to Washington, D.C., so I made a switch to state government, first to the Legislative Analyst Office, and then to the Auditor General's office, and ultimately became Auditor General.
Right. I remember that. You went from the Auditor General to another job.
Yes, I was nominated to be Treasurer of the state of California after Jess Unruh died. I'd never been in a partisan position before. I ultimately became the shortest political career in the history of California. I served for 2 years, appointed and confirmed by the legislature, ran for office, was defeated by Kathleen Brown, Governor Jerry Brown's sister, and that was the end of my political career, but I was treasurer for 2 years.
But given, the jobs you had before, you were always declined to state.
Correct.
So you had to suddenly pick a party, and Governor Wilson asked you to be the treasurer, right?
No,
or run for
Governor
it?
Duke Majan.
Duke Majan, that's right.
Duke Majan.
Yeah.
And so I said yes. I was nominated and confirmed, and I served for 2 years, ran for office, and was defeated.
And while you were state treasurer, you grabbed one of the more famous people in Sacramento, BTE Collins, to be your chief deputy, correct?
I was very fortunate. BTE Collins, a very close friend. I met him first when I was Auditor General, and he was head of the California Conservation Corps.
Yeah.
And we did an audit, and he and I testified against each other in front of a legislative committee. And afterwards, we had a pretty combative time in front of the committee, and afterwards we went out and had beers at David's Brass Rail, a local watering hole, and were friends from that point until the day he died.
Yes. Yeah, he was a heck of a guy. I met him at David's Brass Rail in either 76 or 77.
He spent a lot of time in there.
Yeah, and somebody introduced me to him, and he had been in with the first cabin with Special Forces, and of course was severely wounded in his second tour with Special Forces, lost an arm, a leg, and so somebody introduced me there at the bar, and that was a Thursday night, and they said, hey, Tribe here was in Special Forces, so he came over and he just started talking to me, and he said, okay, it's good to meet you. Hey, I'm moving on Saturday. Be there at 0800, here's the address. And so I was, and I moved him 3 times over the years, but yeah, he was a hell of a guy, and he's buried there in East Sacramento and close to my home, and we go up there on a regular basis and have a beer and pour a little beer on the headstone.
Good, I'm sure he appreciates it.
Yeah, I hope so. So, after state treasurer, what the heck did you do?
I thought my time in state government was over and that I was going to move to the private sector, but the governor-elect, Pete Wilson, called me and asked me to serve as his director of finance, which I agreed to do and served there for 3 budget cycles.
So, when did that start, like in about 91 or 92 or somewhere in
91.
there? Okay.
January of 91.
You picked a tough time. If I remember right, there was a big cutback soon after that.
California had just lost 800,000 jobs. So the revenue coming into the state of California was way down.
Yeah.
And the first budget, we had to cut about 1/3 of the spending that was programmed in from previous years. And it was very difficult mechanically, politically, operationally, everything you can think of. So.
I remember working for a state agency and coming to see you around that time, with my sad story, and you were getting a sad story from everyone. It said, tough it out there, jarhead, and, head out or whatever.
Yeah. It was, they were tough times financially, and periodically the state of California, because of the way that the tax structure is structured, it's heavily reliant on upper income people, and when you have a recession, they don't pay nearly as much in taxes because they don't make as much.
Right.
And so the revenue coming to pay for state expenses for education, corrections, higher education, health and welfare programs, it's very, very volatile. It's very volatile. So, and that was one of those cycles that I just happened to be director of finance when we went through that.
So, after 4 budget cycles?
3 budget cycles, almost 3 years.
Okay. You decided it was time to kind of leave state government.
Well, my friend BTE Collins died in 1993.
Right.
And I'd always said that I wanted to go to the private sector at some point, and it made me realize that life isn't forever, and if I was going to do it, I should do it. So I waited and finished that budget cycle, and then moved into a startup company, investing people's money, using some of the skills that I'd used, learned as state treasurer and as auditor general and as director of finance. So.
Right.
I went into a startup, and it turned out to be do very well.
Then you got a special a request from Wilson, right?
Yes.
And what was that?
In December of 1994, Orange County went bankrupt. They had, the treasurer there had made a number of risky investments. He'd bet on interest rates and lost the bet. And Orange County overnight lost $1.7 billion in investment losses, which caused them to go into bankruptcy. The governor called me and asked me if I would go down there. Actually, the county supervisors had called me and said, would you come in and help us straighten this out? And I basically declined. Then my good friend, Governor Pete Wilson, called and said, really, we really appreciate it if you go down there. So I went down and spent 3 months basically liquidating their risky investment pool and turning it into something that was more suitable for a local government.
Then you became, I think the term I heard was like Litigation Czar.
Yes. After I finished restructuring the investment pool, I went back to my company, and I was helping them pro bono on and off for the following year at Orange County and the attorneys that were working on the bankruptcy. And I was approached by them and said, we have to file lawsuits. There's 200 units of government that had money in this pool. We can't all file separate lawsuits. It doesn't make any sense. But they would like you to agree to come in and be the single plaintiff representing all of them, which after some negotiations I agreed to do, and we did, and recovered about $800 million
Wow.
From various defendants.
Great, good job.
So, well,
It was quite an accomplishment.
I was very happy with that.
I thought maybe they'll become another state now when all this sort of stuff happened, or it didn't look very promising.
No, they were that when you can't lose $1.7 billion and come out of it smelling like a rose. No.
What's their status now? Are they in pretty good shape, or?
They're back a fully operational and functional county. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, any government in the United States, any government in California has fiscal problems.
Right.
I mean, there's pension problems. There's always more pressure to spend money and spend more money than you have, and so they're combating those type of problems. But I don't see that they're on the verge of any traumatic downturn.
Yeah. Well, thanks to you.
No, I don't think thanks to that. Thanks to the people of Orange County. They're the ones that have to ultimately elect people to manage their affairs.
So, currently you're retired?
Pretty much retired, yes.
Yeah. You still do some board stuff and...
Mm-hmm. I work with the board of U-Haul's parent, which is Americo, and so I spend some time every month with them.
And you live up in the hills?
I live up in Meadow Vista, which is a suburb of Malvern. It's about 2,000 feet in elevation, so we're above the fog and below the snow.
Oh, nice. Well, Tom, I just want to thank you for coming in today and telling your story. Okay. It's really a great one. I want to thank you for your service. So, thanks very much.
My pleasure, Bob.
Really appreciate having you. That concludes our time on Valley to Vietnam. I'd like to thank Tom and say welcome home to him and all our vets. For Valley to Vietnam producer Jerry Ward, director James Scott, I'm Bob Tribe saying so long, and we'll see you next time.